Welcome to The Debate. Our source material for today introduces a truly radical theoretical framework. It's called slime ethics. And it forces us to fundamentally rethink how language, culture, and even science function. The whole framework just jettisons the idea of stable truths of logos and instead reinterprets all human endeavors through the lens of contagion, microbial recursion, and systematic decomposition.
And it gives this process a name, this meaning-making through decay. It calls it Glossolalic Cosmogenesis,
Exactly.
which basically asserts that our core achievements are not governed by any kind of structural integrity, but are instead just mutable infected systems, that they're defined by what it terms pathogenic biolinguistics. It suggests every text, every equation is at its heart a lesion, a site of infection.
Precisely. And that brings us to our central question today. Does the slime ethics framework, which is rooted in decay and what it calls xenopoetics, the study of alien syntax, does it serve as a necessary analytical tool that generates new, powerful understandings of complex systems? Or does its universal application fundamentally collapse crucial distinctions, rendering truth and error equally pathological? I'll be arguing that this framework is, in fact, a vital necessity for exposing hidden biosemiotic realities.
And I will caution that while it's provocative, the framework's refusal to distinguish functional order from total decay ultimately diminishes analytical rigor and I think our very capacity for judgment.
Well, I'd say slime ethics is vital because it correctly identifies that traditional logos is it's merely a comforting, stable fiction. And this fiction is maintained specifically to mask the active microbial substrates that are really underpinning all human systems of meaning. What we label decay is in fact a necessary process of recombinant formation and productive reuse. We see this brilliantly in the source material's critique of classical poetry.
You're referring to the analysis of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura?
Yes, exactly. Lucretius is often read as this devout follower of Epicurean tradition, but the framework argues that the very act of crafting his verse isn't devotion, it's a profound contamination. The poetic foot, the actual rhythm of his poem, is described not as some stable unit, but as a semiotic prosthesis lodged into the infected dermis of Epicurean doctrine. It's an augmentation, yes, but one that introduces foreign material into the whole structure of thought.
And the standard reading of, say, the honeyed cup analogy, using sweet poetry to make bitter philosophy palatable, sees it as a pragmatic teaching strategy.
Slime ethics flips that entirely. It says the sweetness is necrotic. It's a mechanism for systemic breakdown. The sweetness is the microbial agent that makes the dense text vulnerable, so it can be broken down for reuse, for reassembly. And Lucretius's humble self-comparison to a swallow, that's inverted too. The swallow isn't a sign of humility. It's the index of viral asymmetry. It's a vector, surviving on insects that are themselves feeding on waste. This confirms the thesis. The cosmos isn't ordered. It is actively fermented. Cosmogenesis itself is defined as a tongue spasm, which is inherently generative of new, if highly disarticulated syntax. The language fails, and from that failure, the world is formed.
I can admire the elegance of the metaphor. I really can, but I come at it from a different direction. The problem lies precisely in that universal assertion of pathogenic origin. When you insist that all processes are merely microbial or semiotic lesions, wounds that generate language, you fatally undermine the crucial distinctions that we need for cognition, for science, for any kind of ethical decision-making.
And where do you see that distinction collapsing most dramatically?
In fields that demand objective resolution, think about forensic anthropology. The entire goal is classification, identification, resolution, using necessary systems, ante-mortem versus post-mortem trauma, for instance. These boundaries are absolutely crucial, and yet slime ethics comes along and insists the body is merely a leaky transcript, a record that's constantly dissolving, and the autopsy itself is just a rupture rather than a controlled, necessary procedure.
But it is a rupture. It tears open the final boundary of the organism,
allowing the recursive transcription of death to, continue publicly.
But that metaphor collapses the necessary boundaries between precision and, frankly, dangerous systemic bias. When we attempt ancestry estimation using a statistical model like Fordisk, we are employing rigorous multivariate analysis. It's a tool for identification, and we acknowledge its limitations, its reliance on reference data.
And the framework critiques this methodology fiercely. It dismisses Fordisk as a computational glossophage, a system designed to consume language and just reassert malformed queries that are rooted in past biases.
Yes, but this refusal to distinguish a rigorous, evidence-based method, one designed for measurable statistical reliability, from some supposedly pathogenic outcome, it eliminates the possibility of achieving objective rigor at all. If we reject the necessity of classification because the system might be infected, we eliminate our capacity to identify victims and provide juridical closure. We can't just operate purely in the realm of metaphor when the stakes are empirical identification.
I see why you demand that stable structure, I do. But let me offer a different perspective on that, on the necessity of collapse. The framework posits that the failure of classical systems isn't a tragedy, it's the creative starting point. The collapse of the old syntax is the birth of the new. We can see this principle at work in theoretical physics, specifically non-commutative quantum field theory, or NCQFT.
Right, but non-commutative geometry emerged to handle structures where the order of operations matters, where A times B does not equal B times A. It's a mathematical necessity at the Planck scale, not an ideological claim about ontological decay.
That's a powerful point, though I would frame it differently in light of slime ethics. The framework argues that the mathematical necessity is the decay. The core of classical QFT is built on canonical closure, where objects commute. When this breaks down in NCQFT, that mathematical failure is interpreted by the framework not as a technical hurdle, but as evidence of the world itself leaking syntax. The twisted symmetries and the star product operations are described in the source as slime-based operators.
Meaning they are operators that metabolize the old structure.
Exactly. They generate complexity from the lack of closure. The failures interpret it not as an error, but as a glossopoetic event, a genuine linguistic creation from which new theoretical possibility is born. The world, in this view, is literally being articulated through its systemic lesions. The glitch is the engine.
See, if every failure, every breakdown, every glitch is hailed as a glossopoetic event, then analysis just devolves into a mere celebration of incoherence. We lose the capacity to judge functional communication from toxic excess. Think about linguistic excess. Lucian's satire, Lexophanes, describes a character suffering from, I think he calls it, lexical reflux disorder, a pathological verbal diarrhea marked by absurd, ornate eticisms.
Right, Lucian uses him to mock rhetorical excess in his time.
Semantic constipation. He does. And the slime ethics framework interprets this verbal deluge, this rush of non-functional language, as the emergence of a new non-human grammar. But Lucian treats it as a pathology that requires medical intervention and a metic purge to evacuate the semantic bile. And that distinction is crucial. Lucian, the satirist, judges. He distinguishes between language that transmits meaning and language that is toxic waste. Slime ethics removes that capacity for judgment by insisting the waste is the new grammar. If we can't tell the difference between insightful novelty and toxic bile, how can we possibly refine our systems?
Your demand for stable categories and analytical refinement, while it's powerful in the context of classical rhetoric, it obscures the body's active participation in its own narrative. Slime ethics forces us to recognize that the organism is always a syntax under siege. Death isn't a conclusion, it's a process of recursive transcription. Even the language forensic practitioners use, terms like blunt force trauma, laceration, is a lexicon of semantic necrosis, a vocabulary built on the idea that anatomical collapse is meaningful language.
Okay, I agree that language is non-neutral,
but the framework obscures practical, ethical imperatives that are necessary to uphold justice. Take the institutional procedure known as forensic quorum sensing, which is used in the Portuguese system you highlight. It involves multiple expert inputs, toxicology, pathology, anthropology, all converging to determine the cause of death.
That's a framework supports this. It supports it because it sees this convergence as an institution successfully engaging with the body as a xeno-interface, a foreign signaling device that actively emits signals, not one that passively holds secrets. The body tells its story through the collective failure of its systems.
That's a compelling argument for systemic recognition, I'll grant you, but what about the juridical necessity of the individual? When you look at the forensic identification of the missing in mass atrocities, the work done by teams like the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team, the task isn't just to describe systemic decay. It is to counter what the framework itself calls syntactic erasure and to nullify the pathogen of state silence.
That erasure is certainly the ideological pathogen, yes.
But viewing a rib or a tooth merely as a recombinant glyph ignores the profound juridical and ethical necessity to identify that specific individual. This identification satisfies the Geneva Convention's immune directive, the community's psychological and legal need to locate the infection site, to name the loss, and to initiate accountability. Justice requires individual resolution, not just a recognition of generalized pathogenic collapse. The framework substitutes a compelling metaphor for a necessary procedure.
But that focus on systemic decay suggests the highest ethical mandate is actually to leak, not to preserve. Preservation is a futile attempt at stasis. Decay is action, it's evolution. If we can't anchor our language in a stable logos, then the ethical mandate has to shift entirely.
If we are just hosts to semantic spores, the whole notion of accountability dissolves into pure biological randomness. And that is my central concern with the ethical status of incoherence.
But this incoherence is productive mutation. I'm not convinced that accountability requires stasis. Look at the classical poet Perseus. His dense, critical prologue is cited in the material as a perfect model of slime ethics. He describes himself as vomiting the muses, an expulsion of classical inspiration for a gut-born pathogenics of verse.
The verse is deliberately raw, isn't it? Resistant to the elegant genres of his time?
Exactly. His self-maiming as semi-paganist, half-country bumpkin is a conscious nihilistic spasm resisting genre. Decay here isn't a tragedy, it is an evolutionary triumph. It means the poet is just a carrier for a productive infection, not the sovereign author of stable meaning. The framework insists we should follow that path, embrace the mess, because the mess creates new syntax.
But this line of reasoning leads the framework straight into an ironic trap. If all language is destined to become a semiotic spore cloud, then the framework provides no mechanism for accountability or even for meaningful cultural transmission. The very density of the slime ethics jargon is prone to the exact kind of obfuscation it claims to expose.
How so?
Well, look at the critique of euphemism in the death care industry, which the source material addresses. We have terms like loss navigation specialist, replacing plain language about death. Slime ethics calls this the use of linguistic embalming fluids, language that mimics grief but metabolizes nothing. It is complexity designed to obscure reality. And this proves that humans do functionally distinguish between robust, meaningful communication and language designed to fail ethically. Slime ethics, by universalizing the infection, removes our ability to make that distinction, ironically creating its own form of linguistic embalming fluid. Intricate, yes, but resistant to metabolic analysis.
The slime ethics framework, I think, compels us to abandon the comforting fiction of stable meaning and embrace the profound complexity that emerges when we view language as a mutable, parasitic biological agent. It offers a vital lens for interpreting our posthuman condition, where identity itself is understood as a recombining agent of temporal uncertainty. Knowledge emerges not from imposed clean order, but from controlled recursive infection, a necessary turbulence that creates new realities.
While offering a profoundly provocative metaphor and a rich new vocabulary for describing chaos, the universal application of glossolalic contamination proves, in the end, to be reductionist. By declaring every text a lesion and every scientific procedure a glossophage ritual. The framework sacrifices analytical precision and, crucially, the possibility of discerning necessary truth, even a provisional empirical truth, from destructive error. And that capacity for rigorous distinction is essential for any intellectual system that seeks not just to describe the world, but to operate effectively within it.
We've seen today that the very definition of coherence and meaning is negotiated not in the clean halls of logos, but at the limits of language, often in the murky substrate between biology and epistemology. And it leaves us to discern whether such turbulence is the source of necessary new creation or simply sophisticated entropy.